You know that feeling when you finally get tired of chasing someone who keeps pulling away. That moment when you say, I can't keep doing this anymore, I deserve better. That's the turning point. And that's exactly when something fascinating happens, because that's when the avoidant starts to notice your absence. Avoidants thrive on emotional control. Their power comes from knowing you'll always come back. They keep you close enough to feel wanted, but far enough to stay safe. They want affection without accountability, intimacy without vulnerability, and connection without commitment. And as long as you play that game chasing, explaining, proving your worth, they win. But when you finally stop running after them, stop sending that follow-up text, stop trying to decode their silence, everything shifts. They suddenly lose the control they thought they had. They feel an unfamiliar sense of discomfort. They start to question what happened to the dynamic that once fed their ego. At first, they'll do nothing. They'll pretend your absence doesn't matter. They might act colder than ever, more detached, maybe even post something online to prove they're unbothered. But that's all part of the mask, because underneath it, they're uneasy. For the first time, they don't know where they stand with you. And avoidants hate that uncertainty. Sooner or later, they might test the waters. You'll get that message out of nowhere, hey, just checking in. Or I was thinking about you. It's not always about missing you. Sometimes it's just about making sure you still care. Because for them, control feels like safety, and your emotional distance feels like danger. The truth is, avoidants aren't villains. They're people who fear being engulfed, controlled, or hurt. But that doesn't mean you have to keep rescuing them at the cost of your own peace. Your emotional clarity is not a threat, it's your power. When you step out of the game, you teach them something they couldn't learn any other way, that love isn't about control. It's about respect, communication, and consistency. And maybe they'll rise to meet you. Maybe they won't. But what matters most is that you stop shrinking yourself just to make someone else feel comfortable with distance. The moment you stop playing, you start leading. You stop reacting and start choosing. And that's when real love, the kind that doesn't run, hide, or play games, can finally find you. Avoidants maintain power through emotional control because control is their safety blanket. Deep down, avoidant individuals fear the intensity of emotional closeness. They crave love but feel suffocated when it arrives, so they create emotional distance as a defense. The push-pull dynamic they orchestrate is not random. It's a strategy to stay in charge of their emotional environment. They build invisible walls and send confusing signals, not necessarily to hurt anyone, but to manage their fear of vulnerability. When you chase them, explain yourself, or constantly try to reassure them, you unknowingly feed their sense of control. They feel desired but not exposed. You do the emotional work while they observe from a distance, maintaining a feeling of superiority and emotional safety. This control dynamic starts subtly. They may withdraw right after moments of connection, ignore messages, or avoid deep conversations. You start wondering what went wrong, replaying your actions in your mind, thinking maybe you were too much or said something wrong. That uncertainty is where they gain power, because now your focus shifts from what you want to what they need. You start working to reestablish harmony while they stay detached, dictating the pace of the relationship. Their silence becomes the loudest message in the room, and your anxiety grows as you try to close the gap they've created. The avoidance control doesn't come from dominance in an obvious sense. It comes from emotional unpredictability. You never quite know when they'll engage or withdraw, and that inconsistency hooks you in deeper. It activates your desire for validation, making you believe that if you just say the right thing, if you're just patient enough, they'll finally meet you halfway. But that illusion keeps you stuck in a loop where they hold the emotional reins. The more you try to connect, the more they pull back and the more power they feel. It's a cycle that feeds both their fear and their ego. What's important to understand is that avoidants are not heartless. They operate this way because closeness feels risky, Somewhere in their past, intimacy was linked to disappointment, rejection, or loss of identity. So, they learned that control equals safety. By staying one emotional step ahead, they believe they can prevent pain. Unfortunately, that same strategy prevents them from truly bonding. They keep love on a leash, never too close, never too far, just enough to feel secure. When you engage in their emotional game, you reinforce the belief that they can control love without truly giving themselves to it. Your reactions confirm their fears and comfort zones at the same time. That's why their power thrives when you overinvest. Emotional control for an avoidant isn't about manipulation in the traditional sense, it's about self-preservation. They can't handle the chaos of unpredictable intimacy, so they create their own version of control by deciding when, how, and how much to connect. Breaking free from that control starts the moment you stop reacting. When you no longer feed their pattern with your overthinking, chasing, or emotional caretaking, the dynamic begins to collapse. The control they once had starts to lose its grip, and that's when true clarity appears, when you stop playing the game that gave them all the power to begin with. Detachment breaks their pattern because it removes the very fuel that keeps an avoidant dynamic alive, your emotional pursuit. When you stop trying to fix, explain, or chase, the rhythm they've grown comfortable with suddenly changes. Avoidants are accustomed to being the one who withdraws while you remain emotionally engaged, trying to bridge the gap. That chase validates their need for control and reassures them that they can have affection on their own terms without ever feeling truly exposed. But when you step back and detach with calm self-respect, the entire balance shifts. You no longer participate in their emotional game, and for the first time, they experience the discomfort of uncertainty and loss of control. Detachment doesn't mean anger, punishment, or manipulation. It means emotional neutrality. It's when you no longer react to their distance with panic or pain, but with quiet understanding that you deserve reciprocity. This kind of stillness confuses an avoidant because it disrupts the predictable pattern of push and pull. They're used to you trying to fix the situation, trying to reopen communication, or trying to make sense of their mixed signals. But when you no longer feed that cycle, they're left to face the consequences of their own emotional withdrawal. The silence they once used as a weapon becomes a mirror, reflecting their own emptiness back to them. What happens next is revealing. Some avoidants may initially double down on their detachment, pretending it doesn't bother them. They might act unaffected or even convince themselves they've made the right choice by keeping their distance. But underneath that facade, something deeper begins to stir, an unfamiliar sense of instability. They were in control as long as you were reacting, but your emotional calm takes that control away. Without your engagement, they lose the reassurance that you're still emotionally tethered to them. That uncertainty forces them to confront the very feelings they've been avoiding: vulnerability, longing, and the fear of truly losing someone who cared. Detachment also reveals the emotional maturity of both sides. For you, it becomes an act of empowerment rather than defense. You stop seeking validation from someone incapable of offering consistent intimacy. You redirect that energy towards self-respect, clarity, and emotional balance. For the avoidant, it becomes a silent wake-up call. Without your chase, they're forced to choose between continuing their isolation or facing the discomfort of real connection. It's in that quiet absence that they either begin to evolve or retreat further into their shell. The beauty of detachment is that it exposes truth. It shows whether the connection was built on genuine care or merely on the power dynamic of pursuit and retreat. It teaches both people that emotional games only survive when two people play. When one person steps out of the loop, the entire system collapses. The avoidant can no longer feed off your reactions, and you are no longer drained by trying to fix something one-sided. In that quiet withdrawal, balance is restored, not through confrontation, but through self-possession. That's the power of detachment. It doesn't chase, it doesn't punish, it simply ends the game by refusing to play. Their silence often masks anxiety, not peace. When an avoidant pulls away and goes quiet, it can seem as though they're completely fine without you, as if your absence doesn't affect them at all. But beneath that calm surface, there's usually a storm of emotions they don't know how to process. Avoidants have learned to deal with discomfort by shutting down, not by opening up. Silence becomes their shield, a way to regain control when emotions feel too overwhelming. To an outsider, it may look like indifference, but it's actually a coping mechanism, a way to manage the inner conflict between wanting closeness and fearing it at the same time. When they withdraw, it's rarely because they've stopped caring. It's because something about the connection has triggered their deepest fears: fear of losing independence, fear of being judged, or fear of being hurt. Instead of communicating those fears, they disappear into emotional quietness. They tell themselves they need space, but what they're really seeking is relief from emotional intensity. Silence gives them room to reset, to return to the safety of their own thoughts where they can't be rejected or misunderstood. The tragedy is that this very silence, meant to protect them, often destroys the trust and connection they secretly crave. Meanwhile, the person on the other side of that silence begins to spiral. You start to wonder if they ever cared, if you did something wrong, or if they've already moved on. But what's really happening is that they're trapped in a cycle of internal tension. They miss you but can't admit it. They feel guilt but can't express it. They want comfort but can't ask for it. The silence becomes a wall that keeps both people stuck in their separate corners, one trying to understand, the other trying to avoid. This internal anxiety for an avoidant often intensifies over time. The longer they stay silent, the heavier the emotional weight becomes. They might start overanalyzing small moments, convincing themselves that re-engaging could make them vulnerable again. But as days or weeks pass, their confidence in their emotional control begins to crack. The same silence that was meant to protect them starts to suffocate them. They begin to sense the distance growing, and that realization quietly terrifies them. The more emotionally detached they appear, the more anxious they actually become inside. Eventually, many avoidants break their silence with a small, non-committal message, a casual "Hey, how are you?" or a vague comment meant to test the waters. They're not always ready to confront the depth of their emotions, so they reach out in safe, indirect ways. It's not about manipulation, it's about self-protection. They want to know you're still there, that they haven't lost the connection completely without risking full vulnerability. But this behavior exposes the truth. Their silence was never calmness, it was avoidance. It was an emotional pause, not peace. Understanding this helps you see that their detachment is not proof of strength but of fear. The quiet space they create is often filled with inner noise, doubt, worry, and unspoken longing. When you stop interpreting their silence as rejection and start seeing it as anxiety in disguise, you begin to detach from the illusion of their indifference and understand the complexity of their emotional world. Reconnection attempts from avoidance are often about control rather than love. When you finally stop chasing them, their sense of control starts to slip, and that loss triggers discomfort. They may not consciously realize it, but their instinct to reach out is often driven by fear. Fear of losing their hold over the emotional dynamic that once revolved around them. Their return is rarely a sign that they have suddenly evolved or are ready for deep intimacy. Rather, it's a way to check if the emotional door they once left open is still available. It's a subtle test to see if you're still invested enough to respond, to see if they can still pull you back into the familiar rhythm of closeness and distance that makes them feel safe. An avoidance check-in message is rarely direct. It could be something as simple as, "Hey, just thought of you," or "I hope you're doing well." It's neutral enough to protect their ego if you don't respond, but emotional enough to stir up old feelings if you do. The goal isn't always to reconnect meaningfully, it's to reestablish control over uncertainty. When they see you've moved on or stopped reacting, it shakes their sense of security. For someone who thrives on having emotional distance while still being desired, your silence creates a void. Their message is a way to test whether they can still elicit a reaction, whether they still occupy space in your mind. The moment you respond with warmth, curiosity, or longing, the dynamic starts to tilt again. They feel reassured that you're still emotionally available, and once that reassurance is in place, many avoidants retreat again. It's not intentional cruelty, it's reflex. They're drawn back when they fear losing connection, but once they regain a sense of emotional control, the same fears that drove them away resurface. Closeness activates their anxiety, and the cycle repeats. Reach out, reconnect briefly, then withdraw. It's a confusing loop that keeps both people emotionally trapped, one seeking stability, the other seeking safety. What makes this dynamic so painful is that their attempts at reconnection can feel genuine in the moment. They might sound tender, nostalgic, or even remorseful, and part of them may truly mean it, but their sincerity is often limited by their emotional capacity. They can want you and still fear you at the same time. They can miss you and still be unable to sustain intimacy. The contradiction lies at the heart of the avoidant pattern. They crave connection as long as it doesn't threaten their autonomy. Recognizing this helps you respond with clarity instead of hope. When an avoidant resurfaces, your instinct may be to interpret it as love or longing, but it's important to look deeper. Ask yourself whether their return comes with changed behavior, accountability, or emotional openness. If not, their outreach is likely about reassurance, not reconnection. It's about soothing their own anxiety, not rebuilding the bond they once resisted. True love requires emotional risk, and avoidants often struggle with that. Until they're willing to face their fears and communicate honestly, their reconnection attempts will remain shallow gestures of control rather than genuine steps toward healing. The power lies not in how they reach out, but in how you choose to respond, with awareness, boundaries, and a refusal to re-enter a cycle that only offers temporary comfort at the cost of your peace. Your boundaries are your power because they represent the line between self-respect and self-abandonment. When you finally stop playing the avoidance emotional game, you reclaim control over the one thing they can no longer manipulate, your energy. Avoidants operate within a dynamic that depends on your willingness to bend, to overgive, and to wait. Every time you compromise your needs to keep them close, you hand over a piece of your self-worth. But the moment you set boundaries, clear, calm, and consistent ones, you change the rules completely. You communicate that your emotions are valuable, your time is precious, and your peace is non-negotiable. That shift removes the power imbalance that has defined the relationship until now. Boundaries are not about punishing or rejecting someone. They're about defining what is healthy for you. When an avoidant pulls away, your instinct may be to chase or fix things. Boundaries stop that instinct. They remind you that someone else's fear of intimacy is not your responsibility to heal. You can love them, care for them, and still refuse to shrink yourself to fit their comfort zone. When you hold your ground instead of reacting to their push and pull, they feel something they're not used to: stability. You no longer feed the dynamic with emotional overextension, and that steadiness forces them to face their own discomfort instead of projecting it onto you. Setting boundaries also redefines what love means. It stops being about sacrifice and starts being about balance. You stop proving your worth through endurance and start expressing it through self-awareness. The avoidant may test those boundaries by reaching out half-heartedly, withdrawing suddenly, or trying to provoke emotional reactions. But each time you calmly stand firm, you reinforce your own power. You show that your love doesn't require self-neglect, and that you're capable of compassion without losing yourself in the process. Over time, your boundaries become a mirror. They reflect to the avoidant what healthy connection actually looks like. They may not understand it at first because boundaries can feel like rejection to someone who equates closeness with control. But as you remain consistent, they start to see that love doesn't have to be suffocating to be safe. Whether they rise to meet you or not, your boundaries create the space for genuine respect to grow. If not from them, then at least from yourself. What boundaries truly give you is emotional freedom. You no longer wait for someone else's validation or apology to feel whole. You no longer allow inconsistency to dictate your sense of security. Instead, you stand in your own emotional integrity, choosing peace over chaos and authenticity over games. That's what breaks the avoidant cycle. Not confrontation, not persuasion, but quiet strength. When you stop chasing, stop explaining, and stop negotiating your value, you reclaim the emotional balance that was lost. Your boundaries remind both you and them that real love cannot exist without self-respect. And once you embody that truth, you no longer need to play anyone's game to feel seen or worthy. In the end, breaking free from the avoidance emotional game isn't about winning or proving a point. It's about reclaiming your peace and reminding yourself that love should never feel like confusion or control. When you detach, set boundaries, and choose self-respect over chaos, you stop chasing temporary comfort and start attracting genuine connection. Healing begins the moment you realize that walking away from inconsistency is not loss, but liberation. Thank you for listening, for valuing your worth, and for choosing to grow beyond patterns that no longer serve your heart.